Every spring break, somewhere in Cancun, a 21-year-old is standing on a bar counter, pouring cheap tequila down their throat while a crowd chants their name. Salt on the wrist, lime in the teeth, consequences tomorrow. Tequila has caused more regrettable decisions, more bar fights, and more mornings after than almost any spirit on the planet. But here's what almost nobody pouring those shots realizes. For over 1,000 years before it ever touched a shot glass, this drink was sacred. The ancient people of Mexico believed agave was a gift from the gods, and if you drank it without permission, you didn't get a hangover, you got a death sentence. So how did a restricted holy sacrament become the official drink of bad decisions? Central Mexico, roughly 2,000 years ago, long before anyone called this land Mexico, the people living across the high volcanic plateaus and humid lowlands of Mesoamerica had built their entire lives around a single plant, the maguey. You probably know it as agave, that spiky, thick-leafed plant that looks like it belongs on another planet. But to the Nahua people, and later the Aztecs, agave was everything. And that's not an exaggeration. They ate the roasted heart of the plant, which they called the piña because it looked like a giant pineapple. They stripped the long, fibrous leaves and wove them into rope, sandals, and cloth. The sharp spines at the tip of each leaf became sewing needles. The sap was used as a sweetener, a wound treatment, and a kind of natural soap. The dried leaves became roofing material. One plant, a dozen survival uses. In a region where resources could be scarce and unpredictable, agave was the difference between thriving and starving. And then there was what happened when you fermented the sap. The Aztecs called the fermented drink pulque. It was thick, milky white, slightly sour, and mildly alcoholic. Somewhere between a sour beer and a thin yogurt. Not exactly the kind of thing you'd order at a nightclub. But pulque wasn't a party drink. It was a religious instrument. The Aztecs believed that the goddess Mayahuel had given the agave plant to humanity as a divine gift. Mayahuel was depicted with 400 breasts, each one nourishing one of her 400 rabbit children, the Sensun Totoctin, who were the gods of drunkenness. And no, I'm not making that up. 400 rabbit gods of drunkenness. The Aztec mythology around alcohol was wild, but despite having literal gods of intoxication in their pantheon, the Aztecs did not mess around when it came to who was allowed to drink. Pulque was strictly reserved for priests during ceremonies, for warriors before heading into battle, for the elderly who had earned the right, and for pregnant or nursing women who needed the calories. If you were a regular person caught drinking pulque without authorization, the punishment for a first offense was public humiliation, getting your head shaved in front of your entire community. A second offense meant death. Think about that for a second. A civilization that worshipped 400 gods of drunkenness was simultaneously handing out death sentences for unauthorized drinking. Pulque wasn't recreation. It was a direct line to the divine, and the Aztec ruling class guarded that connection with absolute ferocity. For centuries, this system held. The priesthood controlled the agave fields, controlled the fermentation process, and controlled who got access. Pulque flowed through Aztec religious life, the way communion wine flows through a Catholic mass, except the consequences of sneaking a sip were considerably worse. The Aztecs had built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Western Hemisphere. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was a city of over 200,000 people built on a lake with aqueducts, floating gardens, and a social order that kept everything running with brutal precision. Pulque was woven into that order. It had its place, it had its rules, and nobody was about to change that. Nobody who lived there, anyway. Because in 1519, wooden ships appeared on the eastern coastline, carrying 500 soldiers, a handful of priests, and a man named Hernán Cortés. They brought horses, steel swords, cannons, and smallpox. They also brought a technology the Aztecs had never seen, distillation, and they were very, very thirsty. Cortés and his men had a drinking problem, not in the way you're thinking. They'd brought barrels of Spanish brandy and wine on the voyage, and the supply was running out. Resupply ships from Spain took months, sometimes longer, and the tropical heat of the Gulf Coast wasn't doing their remaining stockpile any favors. Soldiers need morale. Morale, in the 16th century, ran on alcohol. So the Spanish did what conquering armies have always done. They looked around for something local to drink. They found pulque. The Aztec priesthood was collapsing under the weight of colonization, and with it, the entire system of rules that had kept pulque sacred and restricted for centuries. The Spanish didn't just dismantle the temples and smash the idols. They tore apart the social framework that had given pulque its meaning. Without the priests controlling production, without the threat of execution hanging over unauthorized drinkers, pulque went from divine sacrament to common beverage almost overnight. Regular people could drink freely for the first time in living memory. But the Spanish weren't satisfied with pulque. It was too mild, too thick, too sour for European palates. They wanted something stronger. And this is where the real shift happened, because the conquistadors carried knowledge the Aztecs never had. They understood distillation, the process of heating a liquid, capturing the vapor, and condensing it back into a much stronger spirit. The Moors had brought this technique to Spain centuries earlier, and now the Spanish brought it across the Atlantic to Mexico. Sometime in the mid-1500s, likely in the hills of western Mexico, someone applied a copper still to fermented agave juice for the first time. The result was a rough, fiery spirit they called vino de mezcal, mezcal wine. It was crude, it burned, going down, but it was strong. It was cheap to produce from a plant that grew everywhere, and it gave the soldiers exactly what they wanted. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't, because vino de mezcal wasn't just a drink. It was the ancestor of every bottle of tequila that would ever be poured. Now, mezcal was being produced across multiple regions of Mexico, but one area had a particular advantage. The state of Jalisco, in western Mexico, had volcanic red soil and a highland climate that turned out to be perfect for growing one specific variety of agave, the blue Weber agave. It was larger, sweeter, and produced a cleaner-tasting spirit than agave from other regions. The town at the center of this production was called Tequila, named after the Tequila people who had lived there long before the Spanish arrived. The combination of that volcanic terroir, that specific agave species, and the Spanish distillation technique created something with real commercial promise. Local hacienda owners started planting agave fields across the Jalisco highlands, and small-scale distilleries began popping up around the town of Tequila. The drink was starting to develop an identity beyond just that rough agave spirit the soldiers make. But identity and industry are two very different things. Mezcal de Tequila was still a regional product with no regulation, no branding, and no distribution beyond local markets. It would take 200 more years and one very ambitious family to change that. A family whose name you can still find on bottles in every liquor store on Earth. In 1758, a Spanish colonial landowner named José Antonio de Cuervo petitioned the King of Spain for something unusual. He didn't want a military title or a trade monopoly. He wanted permission to cultivate agave on a specific parcel of land in Jalisco. The crown granted it, giving Cuervo the first official land grant dedicated to commercial agave farming in Mexican history. At the time, it probably seemed like a minor administrative footnote. A farmer wanted to grow a spiky desert plant. Fine. Approved. But the Cuervo family understood something that nobody else in Mexico had figured out yet. Mezcal de Tequila wasn't just a local drink. It was a product with real scale potential. The blue agave grew abundantly in Jalisco's volcanic highlands. Production costs were low, and demand was steady across the region. All it needed was someone willing to treat it like a business instead of a backyard hobby. Over the next few decades, the Cuervo family expanded their agave fields and refined their distillation process at their hacienda near the town of Tequila. They built stone-walled distilleries called tabernas, where workers roasted agave hearts in underground pit ovens, crushed them with massive stone wheels called tajonas, and fermented the juice in wooden vats before running it through copper stills. The process was slow, physical, and labor-intensive, but the product coming out the other end was getting better with every batch. Then, in 1812, José María Guadalupe de Cuervo, a descendant of the original José Antonio, secured the first official license from the Spanish crown to produce and sell mezcal de tequila commercially. This wasn't a land grant anymore. This was a manufacturing permit. The Cuervo family was now a legitimate spirits company, operating with royal authorization in a colonial economy that ran on paperwork and permissions. And here's where the distinction between mezcal and tequila starts to matter. Mezcal is the broad category. Any spirit distilled from any type of agave, anywhere in Mexico, is technically mezcal. But tequila is a specific subset. It can only come from designated regions, primarily the state of Jalisco, and it can only be made from one species, Blue Weber agave. The Cuervo family didn't just produce tequila. They helped define what tequila was by establishing production standards in the region that would eventually become the legal definition of the product itself. But the Cuervos weren't alone for long. In 1873, a man named Don Zenobio Sauza founded his own distillery in the town of Tequila, just down the road from the Cuervo operation. Sauza was ambitious in a different way. While Cuervo focused on building a domestic empire, Sauza looked outward. He became the first producer to officially export tequila to the United States, shipping barrels across the border and into a market that had never tasted anything like it. The rivalry between Cuervo and Sauza drove both families to improve their product, expand their operations, and fight for dominance in an industry they were basically inventing as they went. Cuervo leaned into volume and brand recognition. Sauza pushed for international reach. Between the two of them, they turned a regional Jalisco spirit into something with national pride attached to it. By the early 1900s, tequila had a name, a hometown, two competing dynasties, and a growing reputation beyond Mexico's borders. It was a real industry now, with distilleries, supply chains, and export routes. The drink that had started as a rough soldier's spirit in a colonial backwater was becoming something Mexico could put on a label and sell to the world. But it still needed a spark, something to launch it from a regional curiosity into a global phenomenon. That spark came from three directions at once, and the first one was a law passed not in Mexico, but in the United States. A law that banned every drop of alcohol in the country. In January of 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect, and overnight, the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol became illegal across the entire country. Prohibition. 13 years of enforced sobriety, at least on paper. In practice, Americans did what Americans have always done when told they can't have something. They found a way around it. For people living near the southern border, that way was a short drive into Mexico. Border towns like Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, and Nuevo Laredo exploded with bars, cantinas, and nightclubs practically overnight. American tourists flooded across the border on weekends, looking for the one thing they couldn't get at home, and the cheapest, most readily available spirit waiting for them on the other side, tequila. It was everywhere. It was strong, and it was legal the moment you stepped across the Rio Grande. This was the first time large numbers of Americans had ever tasted tequila, and they brought that taste back with them. Even after Prohibition ended in 1933, the habit stuck. Tequila had planted itself in the American drinking vocabulary, and it wasn't leaving. But tequila still had a problem. Most Americans didn't actually love the taste of straight tequila. It was harsh, it was unfamiliar, and it didn't mix easily with the cocktails people were used to ordering. Tequila needed a vehicle. Something that could make it approachable for people who weren't used to sipping agave spirits neat in a Jalisco cantina. Enter the margarita. Now, who actually invented the margarita is one of the most fought-over questions in cocktail history. At least a dozen people have claimed credit, and none of the stories quite line up. One version says Carlos Danny Herrera created it in 1938 at his restaurant Rancho La Gloria in Tijuana for a customer named Marjorie King, who was allergic to every spirit except tequila. Another story credits Don Carlos Orozco, a bartender in Ensenada, who reportedly mixed tequila orange liqueur, and lime juice in 1941 and named it after his girlfriend, Margarita. A third version puts the invention in Acapulco in 1948, where Dallas socialite Margarita Sames allegedly mixed the drink at a house party for her wealthy friends. Nobody can prove any of these stories definitively, but honestly, the origin doesn't matter nearly as much as what the margarita did. It gave tequila a delivery system. Suddenly, you didn't need to grimace through a shot. You could drink tequila in a salt-rimmed glass with lime and triple sec, and it tasted like a vacation. The margarita turned tequila from a rough border town spirit into something you'd order at a restaurant in Chicago or New York. And then, Hollywood showed up. Through the 1950s and 60s, American movies and television fell in love with Mexico as an exotic backdrop. Films shot in Acapulco, stories set along the Pacific coast, celebrities vacationing in Cabo San Lucas and Puerto Vallarta. Mexico became glamorous in the American imagination, and tequila rode that wave of cultural fascination perfectly. It wasn't just a drink anymore, it was a souvenir. A taste of somewhere warm and exciting and different from wherever you actually lived. These three forces, Prohibition creating the first wave of American tequila drinkers, the margarita making it accessible, and Hollywood making it aspirational, hit in sequence over about 40 years. By the late 1960s, tequila had gone from a regional Jalisco product to a spirit being poured in bars across the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe. Exports were climbing every year. New distilleries were opening across Jalisco to meet demand. But this wasn't just about tequila anymore. It was about Mexico's national identity. And the Mexican government was watching all this growth with a mixture of pride and genuine alarm. Because there was nothing stopping a distillery in Texas or California from buying cheap agave, distilling it in an American warehouse, and slapping the word tequila on the label. If that happened at scale, it would gut the Jalisco producers and turn tequila into a generic category that anyone could exploit. Mexico needed to build a legal wall around its most famous export. And they needed to do it fast. In 1974, the Mexican government did something that would shape the tequila industry for the next half-century. They declared tequila a product with denomination of origin. If you've ever wondered why sparkling wine from anywhere other than the Champagne region of France can't legally be called champagne, it's the same idea. Mexico drew a line in the sand and said, if it's not made in designated regions of Jalisco or in small approved areas of 4 neighboring states, from 100% blue Weber agave, using approved methods, you cannot call it tequila. Period. To enforce this, they established the Consejo Regulador del Tequila, the CRT. Think of them as tequila's regulatory police. Every distillery producing tequila in Mexico operates under CRT oversight. They inspect production facilities, verify agave sourcing, and certify that what goes into the bottle matches what's on the label. The regulations set 2 tiers. The premium standard is 100% agave tequila, meaning every drop of sugar in the fermentation comes from blue Weber agave. The lower tier, called mixto, only requires 51% agave sugars. The other 49% can come from cheaper sources like cane sugar. Mixto is the stuff that fills the bottom shelf at your local liquor store. It's also the stuff responsible for roughly 90% of the world's worst tequila hangovers. So, yeah, not great. But the legal protection was only half the story. The other half was growing the agave itself. Blue Weber agave is not a crop you can rush. A single plant takes somewhere between 7 and 10 years to fully mature before it's ready for harvest. You can't speed that up with fertilizer or irrigation tricks. The plant grows on its own schedule, storing sugars in its massive core over the better part of a decade. And when it's finally ready, the harvest is done by hand. Jimadores, the agave farmers of Jalisco, use a flat-bladed tool called a coa to strip away the thick, spiny leaves and expose the piña at the center. A skilled jimador can tell by looking at a plant whether it's hit peak sugar content. The craft has been passed from fathers to sons across generations in Jalisco farming communities. It's physically brutal work, done in direct sun across sprawling highland fields, and there's no machine that can replicate the judgment a good jimador brings to the harvest. Mexico had drawn its borders, established its rules, and built an industry around craft and regional identity. Tequila was protected, but there was one thing the Mexican government couldn't regulate. They couldn't control what people did with tequila once it crossed the border. And what Americans were about to do with it would have made the Aztec priests weep. The 1980s arrived, and with them, the rise of Cancun as the undisputed spring break capital of the Western Hemisphere. Cheap flights, all-inclusive resorts, and a legal drinking age of 18 made Mexico's Caribbean coast a magnet for American college students every March. And the drink at the center of it all was tequila. Not the carefully aged añejo that Jalisco producers were proud of. The cheap, harsh, mixto tequila that cost almost nothing and hit like a freight train. The ritual became iconic. Lick the salt off your wrist. Throw back the shot. Bite the lime. Repeat until you can't remember your own name. Bars like Señor Frog's and Coco Bongo in Cancun turned tequila shots into performance art, with bartenders pouring directly into the mouths of customers lying on the bar counter. Tequila went from a spirit with 500 years of cultural heritage to the official fuel of bad spring break decisions, which, looking back, was either an incredible marketing success or an incredible cultural tragedy, depending on who you ask. But here's what makes this era genuinely interesting. At the exact same time that tequila was becoming synonymous with cheap shots and regret, a completely different tequila movement was happening at the top of the market. In 1989, two friends named John DeJoria and Martin Crowley launched Patron. They packaged their tequila in hand-blown glass bottles, priced it at a premium, and marketed it as a luxury spirit for people who actually cared about what they were drinking. Don Julio, another high-end brand, pushed the same message. Sip it, don't shoot it. Taste the agave, don't drown it in salt and lime. Tequila had developed a split personality. On one side, the $5 shot that fraternity pledges pounded at beach bars in Cancun. On the other, the $150 bottle that hedge fund managers kept on their office shelf. Same spirit, same plant, same country of origin. Two completely different worlds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into tequila's wild history, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. Now, tequila's split personality was already fascinating. But in the 2000s, a new kind of customer walked into the agave fields and blurred the line between the cheap shot and the luxury bottle completely. The celebrity. In 2017, George Clooney and his business partners sold their tequila brand, Casamigos, to the drinks giant Diageo for roughly $1 billion. $1 billion for a tequila company that Clooney had started almost as a joke, making small batches for friends at his vacation home in Cabo San Lucas. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry. And suddenly, every celebrity with a business manager and a taste for agave wanted in. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson launched Teremana Tequila, and it moved over 1 million cases in its first full year on the market. Kendall Jenner launched 818 Tequila, named after the 818 area code in Los Angeles. Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Nick Jonas, Elon Musk's ex-partner, reality TV stars, retired athletes. The celebrity tequila gold rush was on, and it seemed like every month brought a new famous face holding a bottle in front of a blue agave field they'd visited once for a photo shoot. Now, most of these celebrity brands do source their agave from Jalisco. The tequila is real. It meets the CRT regulations. But the tension this created in Mexico was also real, and it ran deep. Many jimadores and smaller traditional distillers watched global demand for their agave skyrocket, while the profits flowed overwhelmingly towards celebrity marketing operations based in Los Angeles and New York. The famous faces got the magazine covers. The farming families in the Jalisco highlands got a purchase order, and the demand itself created a crisis. Around 2017 through 2020, the celebrity boom collided with tequila's fundamental bottleneck, that 7 to 10 year agave growth cycle. You can't just plant more agave and have it ready next quarter. Demand was growing exponentially, but the supply of mature blue Weber agave couldn't keep up. Agave prices spiked by roughly 800% in some markets. Smaller, traditional producers who had been making tequila for generations suddenly couldn't afford their own raw material. Some were forced to sell their operations to larger corporate buyers backed by international capital. A drink that Mexico had fought to legally protect was now being economically captured by forces outside the country's control. Celebrities made tequila fashionable. The Mexican government made it legal. Spring breakers made it infamous. But after 500 years of reinvention, there's a question nobody's really answering. Does the drink sitting on your bar shelf have anything left in common with what the Aztec priests poured under the moonlight? Maybe more than you'd think. Because something interesting is happening in Mexico right now. In Mexico City, pulquerias, the traditional pulque bars that had nearly disappeared over the past century, are reopening. Young Mexicans are walking into these small, colorful neighborhood spots and ordering the same thick, milky, fermented agave drink that their ancestors were once executed for consuming without permission. It's become a quiet act of cultural reclamation. Not trendy in the Instagram sense. More like a generation deciding to remember something that almost got erased. At the same time, Mezcal, tequila's smokier and older cousin, has surged in popularity both inside Mexico and internationally. Part of the appeal is the taste, which is earthier and more complex than most tequilas, but part of it is the story. Mezcal feels closer to the original spirit. The production methods are more traditional, the batches are smaller, and the connection to specific communities and landscapes is more visible. People are reaching back towards something that feels less manufactured, less corporate, more rooted. The agave plant is still growing in the volcanic red soil of Jalisco. Jimadores are still walking the highland fields with their coas, stripping leaves in the sun the same way their grandfathers did. The goddess Mayahuel is still painted on the walls of small-town distilleries and mezcal bars across Mexico. 500 years of conquest, commerce, celebrity branding, and spring break chaos. And the plant at the center of it all hasn't changed at all. It still takes a decade to grow. It still has to be harvested by hand. And it still produces something that people, for reasons sacred and profane, can't seem to stop reaching for. So the next time you're holding a shot of tequila, whether it's a cheap pour at a beach bar in Cancun or an aged añejo in a heavy crystal glass, it might be worth pausing for a second before you throw it back. Because 1,000 years before you, someone held a cup of fermented agave under the open sky and believed they were touching something divine. The drink changed, the plant didn't. And somewhere in the space between those two facts, the entire story of tequila lives.